I'd like to introduce Nicholas Bellantoni, the Connecticut State Archaeologist Emeritus, who oversaw the excavations and testing that we did, and he will present the findings tonight. So, Nick, if you want to take
Great, thank you, David. Yeah, basically, just like David said, what we'll do is we'll go over the work we did in the field, how we were able to discover the unmarked graves. Again, these are graves that don't have tombstones. So it's a matter of determining in these old cemeteries, ancient burial grounds, where the remains might be located. So I'll give you the background on that. And also, where the remains to be removed, I'll talk also about how we do that archaeologically, and then of course the reburial project and through the whole thing. I just want to point out my colleague Ernie Wiegand is working with me. Ernie is right now teaching a course at Norwalk Community College. Should be here momentarily, but just to acknowledge Ernie on the project. Don't know how clear this is going to be, but you see the cemetery, basic map of the cemetery with the road going through. Orient you, this is Crescent Street. Over here would be across the street would be the railroads, and of course I-95, which as David has mentioned, has already had an impact on the cemetery when that was put in. The burials, though, the road widening project really extends this area right in here. It's just a thin triangle that comes up from a telephone pole, but extends it right in through here. And as you can see, there's not many burials. There's one tombstone off to the side, but whether there were any individuals there. The thing is how burials are laid out, and in terms of our ability to find them and predictively how to work. This is a Christian burial ground going back to the 18th century and into the 19th century. So people are laid basically, as you wrote, on their back in an east-west orientation with head to the west. And that is so as you lay in the ground, you are prepared for the day of resurrection. Christ will come up with the sun and literally draw you from your housing, and you will join in the resurrection. So the burials of faith, that means when you go to the cemetery and you read, here lies Jonathan Edwards, Jonathan is not in front of the stone, Jonathan's actually behind the stone with his feet moving away, facing toward the east. And also to mention, these as Christian burials, for the most part, there are no funerary objects or anything inside. You'll get coffin material, certainly hardware that may have rusted and survived. But also, maybe some shroud pins. These were probably people that didn't have, because they didn't have a tombstone, really affects that they probably were, socioeconomics could not, or were not able to get a tombstone. So basically shroud pins, probably buried naked. People were not really buried with clothing unless they were very wealthy. And into the 20th century, we start seeing that simply because of the fact that, with the textile mills, clothing becomes more affordable. And we see that. So the positioning of the burials is important, because when we look for them with the radar that David mentioned, we need to run the radar in a way that's going to strike the burials perpendicular, not going east-west with the stones, but coming north-south so that we could see the rows of potential burials that might be there. And you can see the ground-penetrating radar here. It's kind of in a crib. And we use this as a first test. It's non-destructive, non-intrusive. And basically what it is, it's a sled that tracks over the lawn. And what it does is it sends a short radio wave into the ground from a transmitting antenna. When it hits something, it bounces back to a receiving antenna. And within the computer printout, you get images, and I'll show you those in a moment, of what the images look like. The radar does not reflect the bones. It does not reflect the old coffins. If there's a metal coffin there, it may reflect off of that. But primarily what it's reflecting is the change in the soil pattern based on the excavation of the burial shaft. You dig a hole, you go down 4, 5, 6 feet, whatever it might be. You lay the coffin down, and then you put the dirt back into the hole to refill it. Well, you've done a number of things. You've mixed and modeled the soil. The colorations of the actual stratifications now are homogenized, so you get modeled soils. It changes the compaction of the soil. Anybody that's dug in their yard, you know that it's hard to dig, but once you put the soil back into the hole, it's airy. And so the compaction is different. The coloration is different, the paction is different, even the chemistry changes a bit on the soil. So what you see here is we had the radar done not just in the area back here where the road widening will occur, but in other areas to test the radar to see how it will work within the cemetery and to look for within that immediate area where unmarked graves might be. The white flags you see here are where the radar got hits. And as you can see, many of them are associated with known stones. Sometimes in the old cemeteries, you know, you can't always be sure just because you got a tombstone, you got a body there. Because tombstones have been moved around. Some tombstones were brought in later, and as a result, they're not always specifically. But in some cases here, you can see that. The area we're concerned, again, is coming along this triangle. And you can see with the radar, we've got a number of hits. We've got a number of hits out there. Actually, about 15 hits. And this is what the radar looks like. This is an example from tanks. But basically, what it does is it reflects back. And these hyperbolas you see are reflecting back, in this case, this example, I should say, from tanks. But burials look almost like the same thing. It'll tell you the depth of the burial, and what you're looking at is soil disturbances here. So these hyperbolas are interpretable. Now, the radar just basically tells you there's an anomaly there. There's something there. It doesn't tell you it's a grave. It could be a stone that's in the ground. It could be roots. It could be a lot of different things that are there and reflecting back off the radar. So what we always like to do, we assume that we're in a cemetery that all of these hits are burials, but you can never really be sure. And with ground penetrating radar, the second phase of that testing has to do with ground proofing. So you can see our hit, it's probably very poor from where you're sitting, but along where the road widening is and the wall will go in, we went in with a backhoe, small backhoe, and cut a trench, actually 2 trenches, with the backhoe to reveal the soil stains and interpret whether these anomalies were in fact graves or not. What we did is on the claw of the bucket, instead of having the teeth that you normally see in a backhoe, we had a blade put over so that each cut is a smooth cut that penetrates and scrapes the ground and highlights the soil coloration differences that we would see and be able to predict then whether we are indeed encountering a burial. And by the way, we only needed to go down below the fill and just enough to see the subsoil. We don't have to go to the graves. We just need to see the subsoil and determine that there's a grave there. And this is an example of what I'm talking about. This is from another burial ground, but if you could see this kind of rectangular, darker soil, lighter soil, the lighter soil is basically the soil composition for that horizontal level, but this is the grave shaft. And you can see it's not only rectangular, it's laying in an east-west position. So that's what we were looking for, coloration stains that might help us indicate whether these hits, these anomalies were in fact graves or not. And again, I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but here is a feature right here. You've got a topsoil, a lot of fill, and then as we got through the fill horizontally, you can see this line coming through here. And this change in the soil coloration, that's the grave shaft. So we were able, of the 15 hits that the radar got, we were able to demonstrate that 12 of them were in fact, or 13 of them were in fact graves. So the radar actually worked fairly well. Again, you can see the fill layer here, having to get below it. And again, I don't know how clear the slide is, but the differentiation in soil color is what we're looking at that allows us to demonstrate ground proof that these are in fact graves. When you excavate, here's another from another cemetery again. This white soil, for that horizontal, that is the natural soil coloration. And you can see the mixed model soil here of the grave shaft, very narrow. And sometimes, when you excavate down, depending on the degree of preservation, you not only get hardware nails, which allow us to do a kind of a CAD three-dimensional model of the actual coffin itself, but sometimes you even get the wooden sideboards of the coffin, and you can see the hexagonal shape here. And what you're looking at are the sideboards. They're gone. The wood's gone. It's decomposed. It's rotting. You can't pick it up anymore. It basically decomposes in the soil pretty rapidly. But it leaves a soil shadow, and that is what we're able to determine. So we actually can, in some cases, actually determine the boundaries of the coffin feature itself. Here's another feature. There's a stone out there. One of the stones that was there was to James. And you can see that stone up here. And you can see, again, the feature of that particular burial. Stone's a little off from the burial, actual burial. It probably was put in much later. And as a result, they probably kind of guessed at exactly where the grave is. But the grave is there. And again, in east-west orientation with the stone. It extends into the project area. This is a good slide to show you the fill. There's a lot of fill out there from the previous road work and also from the highway work too, I suppose. But there's a great deal of fill overlying many of these graves. In the ground proofing and the trenching, we actually came up with some interesting artifacts. This was probably a footstone to Henry Garrison. Died in 1824. We also came up with probably an earlier footstone, probably dating more toward the 18th century, for a J.W. We also encountered coffin nails. So we not only, these are fairly distinct nails, many of these, as a result, some of these burials are very shallow, right off, very close from the fill layer, which means there may have been some stripping and different things going on at the cemetery before, probably again in the early 20th century. But basically with that, some of the burials are fairly shallow. They're not the proverbial 6 foot down for the most part. Even though when they were originally put in, it's very difficult for us to calculate what exactly the depths were at that time. But right now, they are pretty shallow. So here's a map that Ernie and I put together from the telephone pole cutting diagonally here. Of the burial features, there are 11 that appear to be within the project area, and if it is desirable, that would have to be removed in the process of the road widening project. Just to give you a sense of how we do this archaeologically and other burial projects that have had to be removed, you've probably seen it on the Discovery Channel and other history channels and so forth. We work very carefully. We only use hand tools. We use bamboo picks, brushes, in some cases delicate brushes, maybe a hand trowel at times, but all of the work is done by hand and very carefully and meticulously, because one of the things we want to do is be able to recover every bone that's possible. And these bones are going to be in different states of preservation. They're going to be broken up because of some of the earth pressure from above it. And the earth pressure and the decomposition, they're going to be very fragile. So handling it appropriately is going to be important. We do have Dr. Gary Erickson from Yale University, who operates the biological anthropology laboratories, and is really kind of a renowned forensic anthropologist. And he and I have worked on a number of cemetery projects in the past. Looking at the bone that's recovered and trying to say something about the person himself, of themselves, I should say. So that, you guys have seen bones and you've seen CSI and you know all of this stuff already. But you do know that the skeleton that's inside you is not only hard tissue that keeps you upright, protects your vital organs, but it's living tissue. And as a result, it modifies to your life. From birth to death, your bones are constantly changing, and they're changing because of the nutrition you give it, the amount of exercise you give it, the life stress pathologies that have occurred, the diseases that have occurred, traumas that have occurred. And so we can literally, when we handle remains, we can literally do a life history of that particular individual. And I should tell you, it makes it personal. When you deal with these remains, you understand you're dealing with another human being, but you're also getting insights into that human being's lives that has been lost in history. We don't even know their names at this point. But this kind of work will allow for a reconstruction of each individual in terms of their biological heritage, and certainly, hopefully, match that up with archival and historical data. Because basically now what you can do is match the archival data with the forensic data and hopefully come up with maybe even determining which one is Garrison, who J.W. is, and so forth. In fact, this is a project I worked on many, many years ago in a Pickin family of graves where nobody knew the graves were there. They were totally unmarked. It was part of a tomb. no, the Cemetery Association didn't even know there was a tomb. It was rediscovered, and the family asked us to go in and do a forensic analysis of all the remains. And when we did that, we were able to get that biological blueprint of that individual, compare it with pick and family genealogies, and people who were totally lost in history, forgotten, now are remembered, and this stone was placed there to commemorate the 16 individuals we were able to identify through the work. So it's very personal, and we do our best to try to understand who these people are. So that's the recovery end of it. If we did recover them and they needed to be reburied, one of the things we did is we did some ground penetrating radar up here at this area of the cemetery where the stone wall is. And up there we found a vacant area where there are no graves, and also a vault that was below ground. And this is what the vault looks like in terms of the radar. Very distinct, just over 2 feet in the ground. But that is the radar image of a below ground vault. So we know where that is, and we know where the areas that are defined, that where the no graves are. And so that's where the reburials could occur. And this is another former project of mine when we had to excavate the Walton family in Footstone, Connecticut. And when that project was done, the forensic work was done, we brought them back for a reburial. One of the jobs of the state archaeologist in these projects is to try to determine if we could find, through genealogical and historic research, descendants of the people involved. And so in this case, we were able to tie the cemetery to a Nathaniel Walton, who actually purchased the land for the burial ground in 1757. And so with the genealogy of the Walton family, one of the things I did is connected with descendants, found them as far away as California, Nevada actually, and they came back for a family reunion, and their ancestors who had to be removed because of the sand and gravel operation were laid back in the ground with a reburial in the exact rows we found them, laying next to the same people that we found. So those contexts are important in terms of the patterning of the cemetery. We maintain that. And also with the historic research, we try to find out who they are in terms of religious affiliation. So for example, the Waltons were members of the First Congregational Church in Griswold. So we worked with the church. Reverend Bynum of that church performed a recommittal ceremony of Puritan tradition, and the remains were put back in the ground appropriately. So you do it with respect and with the acknowledgement that you're dealing with other human beings, and do it as respectful as possible. So just in review, archaeological excavations were conducted carefully. We are very meticulous in how we work, and every skeletal element is recorded. The remains will be handled with respect and sensitivity. And a combination of forensic and archival research has an opportunity possibly to name some of these people who have been, again, lost in history. I don't want to say a resurrection, that's probably a poor term, but so many people have been forgotten in the past. Family members don't even know where they're dead or buried. And maybe this kind of a project can help at least hopefully identify those particular individuals. And of course, reburial would proceed accordingly with the religious precepts of whatever the historic research helps us with. So hopefully that gives you a little background on what we did, how we found the unmarked graves, and how we would proceed from there.